Hi there, Simon from Harma Studio. Today I'm being a bit lazy or nice, depending on how we look at it, and I'm going to give you a little chunk of a lesson of my course from the ground up. The specific lesson at hand is regarding reference analysis from a series I call Learning from the Masters. The reason I'm doing it is mostly because I've had feedback from several students saying that those lessons were very interesting and eye-opening on how to actually analyze references. And also that they seem to never have had such a proper thorough explanation of the process. So in this video, you'll get a 20-minute analysis of 3 paintings by one of my favorite painter, Caspar David Friedrich. So enjoy. So let's start with some learning from the masters, looking at paintings. First guy I want to talk about is Caspar David Friedrich. He's a German romantic landscape painter that is probably one of my favorite painters, at least from that era. He's quite famous for painting Gothic ruins, contemplation of nature, and basically his sort of style is this idea of like very small silhouettes and super expensive landscapes. So they're this sort of sublime and all that stuff there. It's very interesting. So I've picked 3 paintings. There's again like many that he did that are very interesting. I just wanted to take 3 that could be potentially interesting for us to analyze. So we'll start with Ruined Monastery of Eldena near Greifswald, because it's probably German rather. This one is actually really an image that I like, that I've actually wanted to redo in 3D, and I keep having it in my rendering ideas, but I never really find the time to do it, but whatever. So the way I'm going to proceed is going to be very simple. We know composition is about intent, frame, light, colors, so I'm just going to talk actually quite randomly about it. Like I don't want to have, for some reason, a super structured approach, but you'll see that it's pretty straightforward. So we have a pretty horizontal composition, as you can see. What is interesting is that from the get-go, you can see that where our eyes will tend to navigate is actually at the top here. And what is interesting is you have you can see this, what I call edge flickering, when you have a lot of tension happening because the object, or one of the main object of your image, is actually going near the edge. And here it really creates a lot of tension here. So it means you have your greatest area of contrast and a lot of tension happening in the top. This really works very well because what it does is that it catches your eye here and then you slowly go down and you see then the people here and the little house that you have here. This is in composition what I call the idea of the reveal. That is a certain type of balance where you delay the sort of discovery of the actual subject of the image. What is interesting also is that you have the idea of scale here with the 2 little tiny silhouettes here that really anchor the idea of scale. Another aspect that is quite nice is in terms of shapes. You have one big shape, one huge shape, and one big area here that is divided into smaller shapes. So this also helps in reading this idea of verticality. And this is interesting because I mention it often is you want to have a sort of ratio that fits the sort of size of your ratio of your building. And here we have something that is very vertical. And the fact that we enclose it into something that is horizontal creates also quite a bit of tension. But this is because the ratio here that we're dealing with is actually more related to the ratio of the little house that we have here. You also have, in terms of contrast, something that is pretty basic, but still happening in terms of perception, is that you have this sort of very organic and very dense and very detailed vegetation. And then you have this sort of more monolithic and man-made architecture. And this is interesting because this looks Gothic architecture, which means you have this sort of arches that are very nice and that actually are supposed to be reminiscent of some sort of going to the sky and having trees and stuff like this. So it actually creates an interesting contrast as well. In terms of colors, this is quite fun because you have a lot of greens, a lot of different palettes that are quite cool. And on the other hand, you have everything that is man-made that is very grayish and brownish, but you still have very rich colors that are happening by details here. You have this sort of lacquer or brown or red or whatever that is happening here or here that makes the whole building very interesting and way more subtle and dynamic than actually just a pure stone. You also have, this is something very typical of Friedrich, is that you have very legible planes. So you have this sort of foreground here, then you have this level here with the silhouettes, you have the second ground or middle ground with the house here, and then you have the background with the sort of cathedral and the back, or monastery rather, and the back with the trees in the background. And this creates a lot of depth that is very nice. And also the thing that is done is that you're looking over it. You can see we're not at eye level, we're a bit higher. So it means that you have a better understanding of what's happening in the scene. You also have something that is an interesting, almost flipped logic. I usually say that your eyes are going to be drawn to high density of information. And here, what is fun is that you actually have low density and almost negative space in the center of the image where the actual subject is, and you have a lot of information and density of textures and details and objects in the foreground or around the image, because you have all the vegetation, and vegetation by itself is going to look a pattern, but at the same time is going to have a lot of details that can bring a lot of high frequency details. Whereas here you can see you still have little details, but at the overall it's very simple shapes. So it's a sort of flip logic, because what is happening is that you're actually still noticing the area with the most negative space as the area that is the most important. In terms of lighting, you can see we have a little bit of highlights every now and then that sort of help us understanding the geometry, basically. But you can see that most of our subject is actually, because the sun is coming from here, but a little bit further, everything is in the shadow. And here you have not even cast shadow, sorry, you have a little highlights again. So this is interesting because what it does is that you have a very homogeneous lighting. You can see a little bit of blue in the sky, so it's still a blue sky. But the thing is that since you're seeing it, everything is in the shadow, it's have a sort of burnt aspect for the top. And it means that you have a very homogeneous look inside the image. One thing worth noticing is that if you start trying to fit a grid on top, yeah, the 1.5 ratio is actually, so these are dynamic symmetry grids. There's a whole video about it in Diamond 4. Every time you're analyzing paintings, you will most of the time find dynamic symmetry logic or structure. So here, for instance, you can see that we have the intersection point that sort of helps in placing this element. You have the intersection point that sort of helps in placing this element. You have this diagonal here is the same as the sinister diagonal. You have here the element that sort of helps in framing this part. You have also this sort of branch here and some elements that are following the Baroque diagonal. Some elements, basically, as soon as you have a look at it, yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening, like this one is here, this one that is here also. Here also you have this element reads, this is a reciprocal, and reads this here, and you have also the parts of the trees that are going in some sort of weird direction that are not really logical, because usually it goes up. Here the painters make them go almost perpendicular to those little mutts here that you have. So all in all, I won't say it's a very simple image, because it clearly is not, but it's a very interesting case, because as I said, there's this sort of reversal of the logic of negative and positive space. And there's also this sort of like dynamic symmetry logic that can help in placing elements not completely randomly. Because just to mention it, but the whole idea of dynamic symmetry is that the building blocks or building lines and diagonals that you have a specific ratio that is directly related to the actual ratio of the image, which means that those are lines that are inbuilt or built in rather, or inherent to the overall structure of the image. And those tend to resonate a bit more and have more power in terms of composition. Next image is Neubrandenburg in the morning mist. So pretty beautiful image that I really like. Here you're going to see a lot of, again, subtleties that I quite like that are very specific to the work of Friedrich. In terms of lighting, you can see we're dealing with something with backlit again, with the silhouettes very standing out of the skyline of the image. Something very also specific is that you have this spire of the church. And the thing is that your eyes are caught here, and you only notice a bit later that you have people in the foreground, because they're so blended in the sort of, you can see they have almost the same colors. The only way you can actually understand that those are people is because of the aspect of view, but the colors and the contrast actually don't really help in making them stand out. You still also have this sort of connection because they're obviously gazing at the town here. You have a little flux of birds as well that sort of creates a sort of middle ground, because this is small, this is big, and this is in the middle. You can also notice something that's more technical, but it's this idea of just the way saturation decreases. You have pretty high saturation here. Here it's pretty dark. And in the background, you have this sort of aerial perspective effect that sort of makes all the sort of colors blend in towards blue, whereas the rest of the image is quite green and orange and purples. And the color palette here is actually pretty beautiful. I really enjoy this one. The sky itself is also a big part, literally, in terms of composition, just in terms of ratio, but also in terms of composition, because there's a lot happening. You can see, for instance, that we have basically the clouds are here to help us understand better the shape of the city, because if it was all yellow first, it would be too much probably. You would not feel as much the sort of warmth of the sun if it was everything everywhere, sorry. So the fact that you have this shape helps in understanding and creating contrast and creating warmth here, creating proper contrast here so that you read the shape. And also you have those tiny highlights that are super nice and create a sort of very nice halo effect. Another aspect that is noticeable and that is worth mentioning is that you have this sort of radial composition. Here you can see you have something that is as if everything was pushed away in that direction from the center. So you have these that are going that direction. You have the birds that are potentially going over, at least going along that sort of diagonal. And you have this area here that is opening. And here you just have this part that is kept in yellow. If you look at the potential grid that works with this one, we have the root 2 major area of division. And you'll see, so this one kind of fits perfectly in terms of ratio, which is quite nice. And you'll see that you have interesting lines here. So here's this third, so that's pretty basic. But other stuff are happening that are quite nice. You have, for instance, those secondary ones that show how the sort of sky is opening. You have this one here that is basically letting you understand where is this part stopping. You have the middle here. You have those points here that sort of also define where is the city stopping, which is quite nice. You have those points that give you some sort of altimetry of the maximum for the mountain. You have this literal very strong line here that sort of connects the people with the spire of the church, and other elements in general that are quite noticeable and quite well connected. Basically, every time you're using strong lines like this, you're basically creating very strong connections. So it's always worth noticing. And again, related back to this idea of opening, the idea of soul is to have this spire that creates a focal point and a vertical element that is reinforced by the vertical ratio. And the idea is that you have this sort of upward motion that also is a vertical motion. So there's everything working together in order to create this sort of quite complex image. Even though the scenery itself seems pretty simple, it actually has a lot happening in terms of what makes it a little bit more special than a simple scenery image. And on to the last one for Caspar Friedrich. This one is quite different, actually. I quite like it because it almost does the opposite of what he's been doing until now with the two other examples that we had. Here you have very strong visible shapes creating the sort of basics of the image. Here you have the triangle. And what is nice is that the sort of greatest area of contrast or point of view that anchors the whole image is actually those two people around the fire, which completely shifts the idea, because until now you've seen that generally he focuses on architecture, the scenery, and the people are completely secondary and so blended in that they don't stick out. Here it's the opposite. You also have a very clear cold and warm contrast that is also pretty interesting in terms of symbolism, because you have the fire against the nature, etc. So human versus nature and all that stuff. You also have that same contrast, more against symbolic contrast between the parts of the trees that are cut and the parts of the trees here that are still there. You also have the typical, very noticeable foreground, and then a lot of depth created by different elements. And then that part here, which is the proper background with the moon, that becomes a second element. And you have this sort of dialogue between those two elements. One thing that I find fun is that this element here creates a big mass. And what is fun is that basically it's here in order to not be too open, because if we didn't have that element, it would mean we would have a whole open area on that forest in the back, and this would actually catch our eye way more. So the idea here that the painter has or at least that's my interpretation, is that in order to keep the center of attention around those elements, he's hiding parts of the forest so that you can still get the idea, but not go too much inside that forest. As usual, you have a very high density of detail with a lot of textures, a lot of elements, etc. in the foreground and in the background. Friedrich is like very good at painting vegetation, which is pretty incredible. And this at whatever distance we're considering. If we look at the grid that can potentially work with it, we're again with root 2. As you can see here, you have almost perfect alignment with the heel that you have here. This one is also reminiscent of the reciprocal that we have here. This area here falls perfectly between that triangle. We have that triangle so that it opens up the sky. The moon is like perfectly at the center, like not at the center, but on the axis of the center. And you have like different elements, like all those ones are like perfectly vertical. So they're like perpendicular to that or like parallel to this one. So there's a lot of like geometrical aspect. This is something like you can already tell without even having the grid. Is like when you look at the image, that's what I said at first, is like you have like very strong legible shapes that are legible. And generally when this happens, you know that there's probably some play with diagonals or mid diagonals or stuff like that. And then again, just to come back to the sort of framing, you have something very vertical, and this is like emphasized with the very thin trees, but very dense area here that creates a sort of filter in the back. And then here we're more like with grass and all that stuff, and it's more punctual rather than pattern. So we have little elements and silhouettes, and here we have proper lines. So we have a lot of, all in all, when we talk about Friedrich, there's a few things that I like and that I, let's say, have in my mind when I try to refer back to them, and I use them often in my mood boards. So basically there's this idea of small silhouettes. So you will very often have very small silhouettes to emphasize the building or the landscape or the architecture at play. He does use dynamic symmetry, maybe not willingly or whatever, but it does seem to work with root 2 and phi and all that stuff. So this is something worth mentioning because it means that you can potentially just use dynamic symmetry as well. Silhouettes are often appearing after, meaning, except in that very example, which is for me is counter example, and that's why I've chosen it, but most of the time he will have this sort of reveal idea, the delayed understanding of what is the subject of the image. So you will have an element that will catch your eye and you will only see afterwards what are the other people or other subjects present in the scene. You also have very subtle palettes, but this is typical, or a lot of range in greens and browns and all that stuff, and something very rich. So this is very nice to analyze when you want to have grays and neutrals and to complement them with colors that work. Also use of natural elements to create contrast and emphasize subjects. This is basically this idea of the example earlier with the skies. How can you use natural elements in order to highlight aspects and to put into the darkness others, and to really use clouds and all that stuff to create the proper type of contrast you want. Also this idea of playing with tension at the edge of the canvas. This is something very typical of the, it's called Romantic era, where you tend to have very small silhouettes and they tend to be very close to the edge. In the first example we had, it was fun because you had this sort of window at the top that was very close to the edge and have this sort of edge flickering effect. And also at the bottom, you have the people that create, again, this sort of very strong tension because they're so much at the opposite of each side of the painting. And also just in terms of, let's call it camera placement, he often has a bit higher than eye level point of view on the image, which leads to having a so slightly disconnected perception because you're far from the scene. But at the same time, the fact that he always has very strong foreground, it means that you're still taken into the scene. So this is a nice way of like gaining an overview of something because you're looking over and you have a better view of the scene, but at the same time having very strong foreground that helps you still being anchored in the scene. So that would be some of my top picks for Caspar Friedrich. We can now move on to another painter.
And we're down for now. As I explained, this Learning from the Master series is analyzing the work of different artists in different eras and styles. In the same series, you have other painters such as Claude Lorrain or John Constable. I also analyzed the work of some photographers I like Cyril Weiner, Gregory Crutzen, or Julius Schulman, as well as the work of some famous art studios like Mir, D-Box, or Seki Smith. The idea is that it will be an ongoing series to which I will add new episodes analyzing new artists in each new installment of the course. So if you enjoyed this little excerpt of the course and want to learn more, feel free to go to harma.school and check out the full course on how to learn what matters in AgFizz. Cheers.